Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had always been proud of her stripes. After 8 years in the Army, she wore her rank with confidence that bordered on cockiness. The 28-year-old non-commissioned officer had earned her position through hard work, dedication, and an unwavering belief in her own abilities. Her fellow soldiers at Fort Braxton respected her leadership style, though some found her attitude a bit too bold for comfort. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, Maria strutted into the mess hall with her usual swagger. The autumn air carried a crisp promise of cooler days ahead, and the base buzzed with its typical morning energy. Soldiers moved in practiced formations, their boots creating rhythmic sounds against the concrete pathways that crisscrossed the military installation. Maria grabbed her breakfast tray and surveyed the crowded dining area. Her eyes landed on a table where several junior enlisted personnel sat eating quietly. These young soldiers, mostly privates and specialists, always seemed intimidated by her presence. She enjoyed the respect her rank commanded, perhaps a little too much. "Morning, troops," she announced as she approached their table, setting her tray down with deliberate authority. The younger soldiers immediately straightened in their seats, acknowledging her with nervous nods and mumbled greetings. Private Johnson, barely 19 and still adjusting to military life, looked up from his scrambled eggs with wide eyes. "Good morning, Sergeant Rodriguez," he said, his voice carrying the uncertainty that came with inexperience. Maria smiled, but there was something predatory about it. She had developed a habit of using these interactions to reinforce the hierarchy, to remind everyone exactly where they stood in the military food chain. It wasn't necessarily malicious, but it certainly wasn't humble either. "You know what I love about this place?" she said, taking a bite of her toast and scanning the faces around the table. "The chain of command. Clear, simple, no confusion about who's in charge." She gestured to the stripes on her uniform. "These babies didn't just appear overnight. 8 years of proving myself, leading missions, making tough decisions while others were still figuring out which end of a rifle to hold." Specialist Martinez, a quiet soldier who had been in the Army for 3 years, shifted uncomfortably. She had always respected Sergeant Rodriguez's capabilities, but lately, the sergeant's attitude had become increasingly difficult to stomach. The bragging, the constant reminders about rank, the way she seemed to enjoy making others feel small, it wasn't what Martinez had expected from military leadership. "I remember when I was a private," Maria continued, warming to her favorite subject. "Scared of everyone with more than 2 stripes. Now look at me." She leaned back in her chair, radiating confidence. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, leading soldiers, making decisions that matter. And this is just the beginning. The conversation around the table had died completely. Other soldiers at nearby tables had begun to take notice of Maria's increasingly loud monologue. Some exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their thoughts on her behavior. Private Thompson, who had been quietly eating his cereal, finally spoke up. "Sergeant, do you think you'll make it to Sergeant First Class soon?" His question was genuine, born from curiosity rather than any desire to encourage her boasting. Maria's eyes lit up at the opportunity to expand on her favorite topic. "SFC? Please. I'm thinking bigger than that. Master Sergeant, First Sergeant, maybe even Sergeant Major someday." She counted the potential promotions on her fingers like she was discussing weekend plans rather than career milestones that took decades to achieve. "You really think you could make Sergeant Major?" Specialist Davis asked, genuinely surprised by the ambitious claim. "Why not?" Maria shot back, her voice rising slightly. "I've got the leadership skills, the experience, the drive. Most of these old-timers are just coasting on their years of service. They don't have the fire, the innovation that the modern Army needs." Her words were carrying further than she realized. Several senior NCOs at other tables had begun to pay attention to the young staff sergeant's bold proclamations. Master Sergeant Williams, a 22-year veteran with 4 deployments under his belt, raised an eyebrow as he overheard Maria's assessment of old-timers. But Maria was just getting started. The combination of a captive audience and her own inflated sense of importance had created the perfect storm for an epic display of hubris. "The thing is," she continued, lowering her voice to what she thought was a conspiratorial whisper but was actually still quite audible, "rank is about respect. And respect is about showing people that you're not someone to mess with. When I walk into a room, people need to know immediately that I'm in charge." Private Johnson nodded along, though his expression suggested he was more confused than convinced. "How do you do that, Sergeant?" "Simple. You carry yourself with authority. You speak with confidence. You never let anyone forget what you've accomplished. Maria straightened her shoulders and adjusted her uniform blouse. Take these stripes, for example. Every single one represents months of hard work, successful evaluations, completed training courses. When someone looks at my uniform, they're looking at 8 years of excellence. The junior soldiers around the table exchanged subtle glances. While they respected their sergeant's achievements, her current behavior was making them increasingly uncomfortable. Military leadership, they had been taught, was supposed to be about service and humility, not self-aggrandizement. Specialist Rodriguez, no relation to the sergeant, despite sharing a surname, finally decided to test the waters. Sergeant, what about officers? Do you think your experience gives you insight into their responsibilities too? Maria paused, considering the question. Officer-enlisted relationships were always delicate territory in military conversations. But her confidence was running high, and she felt invincible in her current mood. Officers are different, she said carefully. But at the end of the day, most of them are just college kids with shiny bars who've never seen real action. The NCO Corps is the backbone of the Army. We're the ones who actually know how to get things done. Several heads turned at nearby tables. Captain Peters, who had been quietly reading a report while eating breakfast, looked up sharply at the comment about college kids with shiny bars. As a West Point graduate with 2 combat deployments, he found the characterization both inaccurate and insulting. But Maria was oblivious to the growing attention her comments were attracting. She was in full flow now, riding the wave of her own rhetoric. The way I see it, she continued, there are really only a few ranks that matter in this man's army. Your squad leaders, your platoon sergeants, your first sergeants, the people who actually interface with soldiers on a daily basis. Everyone else is just paperwork and politics. Private Johnson, still trying to understand the military hierarchy himself, asked innocently, "What about generals, Sergeant? Don't they matter?" Maria laughed, a sound that carried more derision than humor. Generals? Please, when's the last time you saw a general? They sit in offices in Washington, probably haven't touched a rifle in 20 years. They're so far removed from real soldiering that they might as well be civilians in fancy uniforms. The mess hall had grown noticeably quieter around their table. Maria's voice, which had been gradually increasing in volume as her confidence grew, was now clearly audible to most of the surrounding diners. What she failed to notice was that several of them were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I mean, think about it, she pressed on, completely absorbed in her own arguments. A general probably spends more time in meetings than most of us spend sleeping. They're decision makers, sure, but they're making decisions based on reports written by people like us. The real work, the important work, happens at our level. Specialist Martinez finally found the courage to interject. But Sergeant, don't generals have to work their way up through the ranks? Don't they understand what it's like? Maybe 30 years ago they did, Maria replied dismissively. But by the time someone makes general, they've been playing politics for so long that they've forgotten what it means to be a real soldier. They're bureaucrats with stars instead of suits. The irony of her statement, criticizing political maneuvering while engaging in the very self-promotion that defined such behavior, was lost on Maria completely. She was too caught up in her own narrative to recognize the contradictions in her logic. Besides, she added with a smirk, how hard can it really be to pin on stars? Once you make colonel, it's probably just a matter of not screwing up too badly and waiting for someone to retire. Several soldiers at nearby tables were now openly staring at their conversation. Master Sergeant Williams had stopped eating entirely and was listening with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for briefings about enemy positions. Captain Peters had closed his report and was watching the scene unfold with a mixture of fascination and concern. He had seen plenty of cocky NCOs in his time, but Maria's current display was approaching legendary levels of inappropriate confidence. But Maria Rodriguez was just hitting her stride. The combination of an engaged audience and her own unshakable belief in her superiority had created a perfect feedback loop. She genuinely believed she was providing valuable insight into military hierarchy, sharing hard-won wisdom with impressionable young soldiers. In reality, she was about to learn a lesson that would reshape her understanding of respect, humility, and the true meaning of military leadership. But for now, She remained blissfully unaware of the storm she was brewing with every word that left her lips. The morning sun streamed through the mess hall windows, illuminating what would soon become one of the most memorable breakfast conversations in Fort Braxton's recent history. Maria Rodriguez, Staff Sergeant Extraordinaire, was about to discover that the universe had a sense of humor when it came to hubris, and she was about to become the punchline. Maria's confidence had reached dangerous levels by the time she launched into her next topic. The junior soldiers around her table had become increasingly quiet, but she interpreted their silence as rapt attention rather than growing discomfort. In her mind, she was educating the next generation of soldiers about the realities of military life. "You want to know what really gets me?" she said, stabbing at her eggs with unnecessary force. "The whole mystique around high-ranking officers, like they're somehow superhuman because they've got eagles or stars on their shoulders." Private Johnson, who had been raised to respect authority figures, found himself confused by his sergeant's casual dismissal of senior leadership. "But Sergeant, don't they have a lot of responsibility? Making decisions that affect thousands of soldiers?" Maria waved her hand dismissively. "Responsibility, sure. But let's be honest about what that really means. They sit in air-conditioned offices, review reports prepared by their staff, and rubber-stamp decisions that other people have already figured out. It's not like they're out there actually doing the work." Specialist Davis, who came from a military family and had grown up hearing stories about distinguished generals, shifted uncomfortably. "My dad always said that generals earned their stars through decades of service and sacrifice." "Your dad was probably being polite," Maria replied with a knowing smile. "Look, I'm not saying they haven't put in their time, but let's be realistic about what high-ranking officers actually do versus what we like to tell ourselves they do." She leaned forward conspiratorially, and the soldiers around the table found themselves drawn in despite their growing unease. Maria had a way of speaking that made her opinions sound like universal truths, even when they contradicted everything they had been taught about military structure and respect. Take a typical general. Probably hasn't carried a rucksack in 20 years. Hasn't cleaned a weapon. Hasn't pulled guard duty. Hasn't done any of the things that actually make someone a soldier. They're administrators wearing uniforms. Master Sergeant Williams, who had been listening from 2 tables away, finally stood up. His movement caught Maria's attention briefly, but she assumed he was simply leaving after finishing his breakfast. She had no idea that the senior NCO was moving closer to get a better sense of exactly what kind of lesson she was teaching these young soldiers. "The truth is," Maria pressed on, "by the time someone reaches general officer rank, they've been isolated from real military life for so long that they probably couldn't lead a squad if their lives depended on it. They're figureheads, symbols, not actual leaders in any meaningful sense." Captain Peters had heard enough. He closed his notebook and approached their table, his expression carefully neutral but his intention clear. "Excuse me, Sergeant Rodriguez. Might I have a word?" Maria looked up at the captain with barely concealed irritation. She had been in the middle of making an important point, and she didn't appreciate the interruption. "Of course, sir. What can I do for you?" "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about senior officers," Captain Peters said evenly. "I'm curious about your thoughts on military respect and the chain of command." Maria's eyes lit up. Here was an opportunity to share her insights with an officer, to demonstrate her sophisticated understanding of military dynamics. She completely missed the warning tone in the captain's voice. "Well, sir, I was just explaining to these soldiers how important it is to understand the reality behind the rank structure," she said confidently. "Too many people get intimidated by titles and uniforms instead of focusing on actual capabilities and contributions." Captain Peters nodded slowly. "I see. And in your assessment, what constitutes actual capability in military leadership?" "Practical experience, sir. Time spent with troops, understanding of real-world operations, the ability to make decisions under pressure." Maria was warming to her theme again. Someone who spent years in the field, who's earned the respect of their soldiers through demonstrated competence. "That's interesting," Captain Peters replied. "And you feel that senior officers typically lack these qualities?" Maria hesitated for just a moment, sensing that she might be walking into dangerous territory. But her confidence overrode her caution. "Not all of them, sir, but many of them have been away from operational units for so long that they've lost touch with what it means to be a working soldier. Several more soldiers had begun to gather around their table, drawn by the unusual sight of a staff sergeant openly critiquing senior leadership in front of an officer. The mess hall's normal morning bustle had shifted into something resembling an audience watching a dramatic performance. Private Thompson, sensing the tension building around the conversation, tried to steer things in a different direction. "Sergeant, maybe we should focus on our own responsibilities instead of worrying about what generals do." But Maria was beyond the point of tactical retreat. She had committed to her position, and backing down now would undermine everything she had been saying about confidence and authority. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps good soldiers from reaching their potential," she told Thompson. "We should absolutely understand how the entire system works, including its limitations." Captain Peters crossed his arms. "So you believe junior NCOs should critique general officers openly?" "I believe honest assessment is always appropriate, sir," Maria replied, her voice carrying a note of defiance that several onlookers found alarming. "If we're not allowed to evaluate leadership objectively, how do we improve as an organization? Evaluation and public disrespect are two different things, Sergeant." Maria's face flushed slightly, but she pressed forward. "With respect, sir, I haven't said anything disrespectful. I've simply pointed out that rank doesn't automatically confer competence, and that real leadership is demonstrated through actions, not positions." The irony of her statement was apparent to everyone except Maria herself. Here she was, demonstrating poor leadership and questionable judgment, while lecturing about the importance of actions over positions. Master Sergeant Williams had moved close enough to hear every word of the exchange. His expression had grown increasingly stern as he listened to the staff sergeant's continued critiques of senior leadership. He had seen plenty of young NCOs struggle with ego and authority, but Maria's performance was exceptional even by those standards. "Tell me, Sergeant," Captain Peters continued, "what's the highest rank you've interacted with professionally?" "I've briefed Lieutenant Colonel, sir. Worked directly with several majors during my deployment." Maria's chest puffed out slightly as she recounted her experiences with senior officers. "And based on those interactions, you feel qualified to assess the capabilities of general officers?" Maria paused, finally beginning to sense that this conversation might not be going in her favor. But retreat felt impossible now, especially with so many soldiers watching. Her reputation for confidence and authority was on the line. "I feel qualified to observe patterns, sir. And the pattern I see is that the higher someone goes in rank, the further they get from actual soldiering." "That's a fascinating theory," Captain Peters said quietly. "I wonder what you would say if you had the opportunity to share it with a general officer directly." "I would say the same thing, sir," Maria replied immediately. "Honesty and integrity don't change based on who you're talking to." The captain nodded slowly. "I admire your consistency, Sergeant. That kind of unwavering confidence in your own opinions is memorable." Something in his tone finally triggered Maria's long-dormant sense of caution. She looked around the mess hall and noticed for the first time how many people were paying attention to their conversation. The normal breakfast chatter had died down considerably, replaced by an almost theatrical focus on their table. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, her voice finally carrying a note of uncertainty. "No problem at all, Sergeant. I was simply interested in understanding your perspective on military leadership and respect." Captain Peters's smile was polite but cold. "I'm sure you'll have many opportunities to share these insights with senior leaders in the future." As the captain walked away, Maria felt a strange mix of triumph and unease. She had stood her ground, defended her position, and demonstrated exactly the kind of principled leadership she had been advocating. But something about the officer's parting words suggested that her morning's performance might have consequences she hadn't considered. The soldiers around her table were looking everywhere except directly at her. The audience that had gathered during her exchange with Captain Peters was beginning to disperse, but their expressions suggested that Maria's reputation on base was about to undergo a significant transformation. Master Sergeant Williams remained nearby, close enough to intervene if the situation escalated further. His years of experience had taught him to recognize the moment when a soldier's confidence crossed the line into dangerous territory. Maria Rodriguez had not only crossed that line, but had sprinted past it with remarkable determination. As Maria sat back in her chair, trying to process what had just happened, she maintained her outward composure. In her mind, she had successfully defended her principles against an officer who had tried to intimidate her. She had demonstrated exactly the kind of courage and integrity that she believed military leadership required. What she didn't know was that her morning was about to take a turn that would redefine her understanding of courage, integrity, and military leadership in ways she could never have imagined. The mess hall slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but Maria Rodriguez remained the subject of numerous whispered conversations. Her bold proclamations about generals and senior officers had created exactly the kind of memorable moment she had been seeking. She was about to discover that being memorable in the military wasn't always a positive thing. The rest of Maria's morning passed in a blur of routine duties and lingering satisfaction from her breakfast performance. She conducted her usual equipment inspection, reviewed training schedules, and supervised her soldiers with the same confident demeanor that had characterized her entire military career. If anything, her confrontation with Captain Peters had reinforced her belief in her own courage and principles. Around noon, First Sergeant Coleman approached her desk with an unusual request. "Rodriguez, I need you to report to the base commander's office at 1400 hours. Full dress uniform." Maria looked up from the maintenance reports she had been reviewing. "Is there a problem, First Sergeant?" "Not that I'm aware of," Coleman replied, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. "Apparently, there's some kind of special briefing or presentation. You've been specifically requested." "Requested for what?" "That's all the information I have, Sergeant. Just be there, on time, looking sharp." As First Sergeant Coleman walked away, Maria felt a mixture of curiosity and pride. Being specifically requested for a briefing at the base commander's office was unusual for a staff sergeant. It probably meant that word of her leadership qualities had reached higher levels of command. Perhaps her morning's display of principled thinking had impressed someone important. She spent the next hour ensuring that her dress uniform was perfectly prepared. Every ribbon was properly placed. Every crease sharp enough to cut paper. If she was going to represent her unit at some high-level briefing, she wanted to make sure her appearance reflected the professionalism she brought to every aspect of her military service. At exactly 13:55 hours, Maria reported to the base commander's office building. The receptionist, a nervous-looking specialist, directed her to wait in a small conference room adjacent to the commander's office. The room contained a single table with 6 chairs, a whiteboard, and the standard collection of military portraits that adorned every official space on base. As she waited, Maria reviewed possible reasons for her summons. Maybe there was a new training initiative that required experienced NCO input. Perhaps the command wanted her perspective on unit readiness or soldier welfare issues. It could even be related to a potential promotion or special assignment. At exactly 1400 hours, the door opened, and First Sergeant Coleman entered, followed by the base commander, Colonel Harrison. Maria stood at attention immediately, her bearing perfect and professional. "At ease, Sergeant Rodriguez," Colonel Harrison said as he took a seat at the head of the table. "Please, sit down." Maria remained standing until the colonel gestured more firmly toward a chair. Something about his demeanor suggested that this wasn't going to be the kind of briefing she had been expecting. "Sergeant, I understand you had an interesting conversation in the mess hall this morning." Colonel Harrison began without preamble. Maria's stomach dropped slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I'm not sure which conversation you're referring to, sir. The one where you shared your assessment of general officer capabilities with several junior soldiers and Captain Peters." The room suddenly felt much smaller than it had moments before. Maria's mind raced as she tried to figure out exactly how much trouble she might be in and how best to respond. "Sir, if my comments were inappropriate, I apologize. I was simply engaging in professional discussion about military leadership." Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. "Professional discussion. That's an interesting way to describe it." He opened a folder that had been sitting on the table. "According to multiple witnesses, you characterized general officers as bureaucrats with stars instead of suits and suggested that they haven't touched a rifle in 20 years. Maria felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact with the colonel. "Sir, I may have been too casual in my expression, but I was making a point about the importance of practical experience in leadership. You also stated that becoming a general was simply a matter of not screwing up too badly and waiting for someone to retire." "Sir, Colonel Harrison held up a hand. "I'm not asking you to defend or explain your comments, Sergeant. I'm simply establishing that they were made." He leaned back in his chair. What I find interesting is your confidence in making such assessments. Tell me, what's your experience with general officers? Maria straightened in her chair, drawing on every ounce of the confidence that had served her so well throughout her career. Sir, I've observed senior leadership during my 8 years of service and formed opinions based on those observations. Direct interaction, professional briefings, joint operations. Sir, I've seen how decisions made at senior levels affect soldiers at the operational level. So your expertise on general officer capabilities comes from what exactly? Speculation based on policies you've seen implemented? The question hung in the air like smoke from a misfired weapon. Maria realized that she had never actually interacted meaningfully with any general officer, never attended briefings where such leaders explained their reasoning, never observed the actual decision-making process she had so confidently critiqued. Sir, I believe my experience as an NCO gives me insight into effective leadership at all levels. Colonel Harrison nodded again. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. He stood up from the table. Sergeant Rodriguez, I'd like you to meet someone. The door to the conference room opened, and Maria's world shifted on its axis. The person who entered was not immediately recognizable as military personnel. She wore civilian clothes, a simple business suit that could have belonged to any government worker or corporate executive. She was perhaps in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat style and wire-rimmed glasses that gave her an academic appearance. Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Harrison said formally. This is Dr. Patricia Williams. Maria stood and extended her hand politely, still confused about why a civilian had been brought into what she assumed was a military matter. Pleasure to meet you, ma'am. Dr. Williams shook her hand with a firm grip and a slight smile. The pleasure is mine, Sergeant. I've heard quite a bit about you today. Ma'am, if I may ask, what is your role in this meeting?
I'm here as an observer, Dr. Williams replied.
I'm conducting research on military leadership and decision-making processes. Colonel Harrison thought it might be educational for me to meet with soldiers who have strong opinions about senior military leadership. Maria felt slightly relieved. This was apparently some kind of academic exercise, not a disciplinary action. Perhaps her morning's comments had been reported not because they were inappropriate, but because they represented the kind of candid feedback that researchers found valuable. I'd be happy to share my perspectives, ma'am, Maria said, her confidence beginning to return. I believe honest assessment of leadership is crucial for organizational improvement. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear, Dr. Williams said. Colonel Harrison tells me you have some fascinating insights about general officers. Maria glanced at the colonel, who gestured for her to proceed. Well, ma'am, I believe that effective leadership requires practical experience and direct connection with the people being led. Sometimes, senior positions can create distance from operational realities. Interesting theory, Dr. Williams said, taking notes on a small pad. And you feel that general officers typically lack this practical experience? Not all of them, ma'am, but many have been in administrative roles for so long that they've lost touch with actual soldiering. Can you give me an example of what you mean by actual soldiering? Maria launched into her familiar themes: field experience, direct troop leadership, understanding of enlisted perspectives. As she spoke, she felt increasingly confident about her analysis. Having an academic audience seemed to validate the sophistication of her thinking. You mentioned that generals probably haven't touched a rifle in 20 years, Dr. Williams said, consulting her notes. Do you think weapons proficiency is essential for senior military leadership? It's symbolic, ma'am. It represents staying connected to the fundamental aspects of military service. And you feel that distance from these fundamentals compromises their ability to make effective decisions? How can someone make good decisions about military operations if they're completely removed from military realities? Dr. Williams nodded thoughtfully. That's a perspective I haven't encountered often in my research. She closed her notepad and looked directly at Maria. Thank you for being so candid, Sergeant. Your insights have been quite illuminating. Maria felt a surge of pride. Her willingness to speak truth to power, to offer honest assessments regardless of rank or protocol, had impressed an academic researcher. This was exactly the kind of intellectual courage that the military needed more of. One more question, Dr. Williams said casually. In your opinion, what would it take for a general officer to earn your respect? Maria considered the question carefully. Demonstrated competence, ma'am. Proven ability to lead soldiers effectively under real-world conditions. Someone who remembers what it's like to be a working soldier. And this is the devil developed as its both of Pryman, consist of president developing practices. Someone who stays connected to the realities of military service. Yes, ma'am. Dr. Williams smiled again, and there was something different about her expression now, something that made Colonel Harrison shift slightly in his seat. Well, Sergeant Rodriguez, she said quietly, I certainly hope I've managed to do that during my 35 years of military service. Maria blinked, not immediately understanding the implication of the statement. I'm sorry, ma'am? Dr. Williams reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather folder. She opened it and placed it on the table in front of Maria. Inside was a military identification card, and next to the photo of the same woman sitting across from her, in the space where rank was listed, were 4 small stars. General Patricia Williams, United States Army. Maria's world went completely silent. The conference room, Colonel Harrison, First Sergeant Coleman. Her own breathing, everything disappeared except for those 4 stars staring up at her from the identification card. She had just spent 20 minutes explaining to a 4-star general why generals were incompetent, out-of-touch bureaucrats who had forgotten how to be real soldiers. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For the first time in 8 years of military service, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was completely speechless. Time seemed to move in slow motion as Maria stared at the identification card. 4 stars. General Patricia Williams, the woman she had just told, in excruciating detail, that generals were out-of-touch bureaucrats who hadn't touched a rifle in decades and had lost all connection to real soldiering. Her mind raced through the conversation they had just finished, replaying every dismissive comment, every confident assertion, every moment where she had explained why senior officers lacked the practical experience necessary for effective leadership. The irony was so complete, so devastating, that it approached the level of cosmic joke. Colonel Harrison watched her reaction with the careful attention of someone witnessing a historic moment. First Sergeant Coleman, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, shifted slightly in his chair but maintained his professional composure. General Williams, Dr. Williams, as Maria had known her for the past 20 minutes, sat quietly, allowing the reality of the situation to fully sink in. There was no anger in her expression, no visible irritation at having been lectured about her own profession by a staff sergeant. Instead, she seemed almost curious about how Maria would handle this revelation. Maria started, then stopped. Her throat felt dry, and her usual confidence had evaporated completely. Ma'am, General, I didn't— Take your time, Sergeant, General Williams said gently. I imagine this is quite a surprise. Maria's face had gone from flushed to pale, and was now cycling back toward red again. She tried to process what had just happened, but her mind felt like a computer trying to run too many programs at once. Everything was freezing up. General Williams, she finally managed, her voice much smaller than it had been all day, I owe you an apology. For what, specifically? The question was asked in the same calm, academic tone that Dr. Williams had used throughout their conversation. There was no edge to it, no obvious trap, but Maria sensed that her answer would be important. For speaking inappropriately about senior officers, for making assumptions without proper knowledge, she trailed off, realizing that listing her errors could take considerable time. General Williams nodded. Those are fair points, but let me ask you something else. Do you still believe what you told me? Setting aside the question of appropriate expression, do you still think your assessment of general officer capabilities was accurate? Maria felt like she was navigating a minefield while blindfolded. Every possible answer seemed fraught with danger. If she said yes, she would be doubling down on her critique of the very person sitting across from her. If she said no, she would be admitting that her confident assertions had been baseless speculation. General, I think I may have oversimplified some complex issues. That's a diplomatic way to put it, Colonel Harrison observed quietly. General Williams held up a hand. Let her finish, Colonel. She turned back to Maria. What do you think you oversimplified? Maria took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. Her usual quick confidence had deserted her, leaving her to rely on actual thinking rather than reflexive opinions. General, I realize now that I was making judgments about responsibilities and challenges that I've never personally experienced. I was assuming that administrative duties were somehow less valuable or important than operational duties, which was presumptuous. Go on? I was also assuming that senior officers lose connection with soldiers and practical military skills simply because they don't perform the same daily tasks as enlisted personnel. That was probably unfair. General Williams leaned forward slightly. Probably? It was unfair, General. It was based on limited observation and a lot of assumption. What else? Maria struggled to continue her self-assessment. The woman across from her had somehow managed to seem simultaneously gentle and terrifying, patient and demanding. It was like being questioned by a particularly skilled therapist who happened to outrank everyone she had ever met. I think I confused confidence with competence, General. I was so sure that my perspective was complete and accurate that I didn't consider what I might be missing. And what were you missing? Everything, Maria said quietly. I was missing everything. The room fell silent for a moment. General Williams made a few notes on her pad, then looked up at Maria with an expression that was impossible to read. Sergeant Rodriguez, let me tell you a story, she began. 35 years ago, I was a second lieutenant in the military police corps. I was absolutely certain that I understood how the Army worked, what soldiers needed, and how leadership should function. Maria listened intently, grateful for any reprieve from direct questioning. I had very strong opinions about senior officers. I thought they were mostly incompetent political appointees who had forgotten what real military service looked like. I was particularly critical of general officers, whom I saw as bureaucratic relics, more concerned with their own careers than with actual military effectiveness. The parallels to Maria's own morning were unmistakable and deeply uncomfortable. I expressed these opinions quite freely, usually to anyone who would listen. I thought my honesty and willingness to critique authority demonstrated intellectual courage and leadership potential. What changed your mind, General? Experience, Williams replied simply. Gradually, as I was promoted and given more responsibility, I began to understand the complexity of military decision-making at higher levels. I learned about resource constraints, political realities, competing priorities, and the weight of decisions that affect thousands of lives. She paused, letting her words sink in. I also learned that the confidence I had felt in my critiques was largely based on ignorance. The more I actually learned about senior military leadership, the more I realized how little I had known when I was so certain of my opinions. Maria nodded, recognizing an uncomfortable parallel to her own situation. Now, General Williams continued, I've spent the last 15 years as a general officer. I've commanded divisions, overseen major operations, and made decisions that directly affected thousands of soldiers and their families. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that this job is nothing like what I imagined when I was a junior officer criticizing my seniors. What's it actually like, General? Maria asked, genuinely curious now rather than simply trying to avoid trouble. It's harder than I ever imagined possible, Williams replied. Every decision involves trade-offs between competing goods. Every policy affects real people in ways that are often unforeseeable. Every day brings problems that have no perfect solutions. She opened her folder again and pulled out a sheet of paper. This morning, before I came to observe your conversation, I made decisions about training schedules that will affect soldier readiness, family time, and unit budgets. I reviewed casualty reports from 3 different operations and wrote letters to families who lost loved ones in service to their country. I participated in a conference call about resource allocation that will determine whether certain units get new equipment or make do with older gear for another year. Maria listened in silence, beginning to understand the scope of responsibility she had so casually dismissed. I also, General Williams continued, spent an hour at the firing range this morning qualifying with my service weapon. Because despite what you told me about generals not touching rifles, I believe staying proficient with basic military skills is important for senior leaders. The last comment hit Maria like a physical blow. Not only had she been completely wrong about this particular general's competence and connection to practical military skills, but her criticism had been delivered to someone who was actually doing the very things she had claimed general officers never did. General, Maria said quietly, I feel like the biggest idiot in the history of the United States Army. For the first time since revealing her identity, General Williams smiled genuinely. That's a strong statement, Sergeant. The Army has a long history and has produced some truly spectacular examples of poor judgment. Despite her mortification, Maria found herself smiling slightly in return. However, the general continued, her tone becoming more serious, what happened here today does raise some important questions that we need to address. She had been briefly hopeful that her acknowledgement of error and apparent lesson learned might resolve the situation without further consequences. Questions about what, General? Questions about your judgment, your leadership style, and your fitness for continued advancement in the non-commissioned officer corps. Her military career, the source of her identity and pride for 8 years, was suddenly in jeopardy because of one morning's worth of arrogant commentary.
General, I understand that I've made serious errors today.
I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate. General Williams studied her for a long moment. What do you think those consequences should be? Maria considered the question carefully. Her usual impulse was to advocate for herself, to argue for the minimal punishment necessary. But everything about this situation suggested that honesty, rather than self-preservation, was the only viable path forward. General, I think I need to fundamentally reconsider my approach to leadership and military service. I've clearly developed some serious blind spots and attitude problems that compromise my effectiveness as an NCO. That's a good start, Williams replied. What else? I should probably apologize to the soldiers who heard my inappropriate comments this morning, and to Captain Peters who tried to redirect my behavior before it got to this point. Also appropriate. Anything else? Maria struggled to think of additional steps that might demonstrate her recognition of the severity of her errors. General, I'm not sure what else would be appropriate. I'm obviously not qualified to assess the full scope of the problem. General Williams exchanged a look with Colonel Harrison, then turned back to Maria. Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm going to give you an opportunity to learn what military leadership at senior levels actually involves, but it's going to require significant changes in your attitude and approach. Maria felt a flicker of hope mixed with trepidation. What kind of opportunity, General? You're going to spend the next 6 months working directly for my staff. You'll observe decision-making processes, participate in planning meetings, and see firsthand what general officers actually do with their time. The proposal was so unexpected that Maria wasn't sure she had heard correctly. You want me to work for your staff, General? After what happened today? Especially because of what happened today, Williams replied. You've demonstrated that you have strong opinions about military leadership. Now we're going to find out whether you're capable of learning when those opinions are wrong. Maria stared at the general, trying to process this unexpected development. What had started as the worst day of her military career was apparently about to become something entirely different. But she sensed that the challenge ahead would be far more difficult than anything she had faced before. Learning humility, it seemed, was about to become her new primary mission. 6 months later, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez sat in the same conference room where her world had been turned upside down. But everything about her had changed. Her posture, her expression, her entire approach to military service. The confident swagger that had once defined her had been replaced by something deeper and more substantial. Actual competence, backed by genuine understanding. General Williams entered the room carrying the same folder she had brought to their first meeting. But this time, Maria knew exactly who she was facing, and the knowledge filled her with respect rather than dread. Good morning, Sergeant Rodriguez, the general said, taking her familiar seat at the head of the table. Good morning, General Williams, Maria replied. Her voice carried confidence, but it was a different kind of confidence than she had possessed 6 months earlier. This wasn't the brittle certainty of ignorance, but the quiet assurance that came from actual knowledge and experience. I understand you've completed your assignment with my staff, General Williams said, opening her folder. How would you assess the experience? Maria had been preparing for this question for weeks, but actually answering it proved more complex than she had anticipated. How do you summarize the complete reconstruction of your understanding of military service, leadership, and yourself? General, it was the most educational 6 months of my military career, she began carefully. I learned more about leadership, decision-making, and responsibility than I had learned in my previous 8 years of service combined. What specifically did you learn? I learned that I had been fundamentally wrong about almost everything I thought I understood about military leadership. Maria said without hesitation, the complexity of decisions at senior levels, The weight of responsibility for thousands of soldiers, the delicate balance between competing priorities, none of that was visible from my previous position. General Williams nodded. Give me an example. The resource allocation decisions I observed during my time with your staff, Maria replied immediately. I used to think that senior officers just made arbitrary decisions about equipment and training based on incomplete information. I didn't understand the budget constraints, the competing demands from multiple units, the long-term strategic considerations, or the political realities that influence every decision. She paused, organizing her thoughts. I watched you spend 3 hours one day working through a single decision about helicopter maintenance schedules. You had to consider pilot training requirements, operational tempo, safety factors, budget limitations, and the impact on soldier leave schedules. The decision affected hundreds of people and millions of dollars in resources. And what was your previous understanding of how such decisions were made? I thought some general probably glanced at a report and signed whatever their staff recommended, Maria admitted. I had no idea about the depth of analysis and consideration that goes into every significant decision. General Williams made a note in her folder. What else did you learn? I learned that effective leadership requires humility, Maria said. The most impressive thing I observed was how often you and other senior officers said, I don't know, or asked for more information before making decisions. You surrounded yourself with experts and actually listened to their advice. That surprises you? It would have 6 months ago, Maria replied. I thought confident leadership meant having all the answers. I didn't understand that real confidence comes from knowing when you need help. The conversation continued for another hour, with General Williams probing every aspect of Maria's experience and learning. It became clear that the staff sergeant had not simply completed an assignment, but had undergone a fundamental transformation in her understanding of military service. Sergeant Rodriguez, General Williams finally said, your reports from my staff have been exceptional. They describe you as insightful, hard-working, and remarkably adaptable. Your attitude adjustment has been impressive. Maria felt a surge of pride, but it was tempered by genuine humility. Thank you, General. I had excellent teachers and a lot to learn. Colonel Harrison tells me you've requested to return to your original unit rather than accept an offer to remain with my staff permanently. Why? Maria had anticipated this question as well. General, I need to apply what I've learned at the level where I can have the most direct impact. I want to be a better NCO for my soldiers, and I think I can serve them better now that I understand what leadership actually means. And what does leadership actually mean? Service. Maria replied without hesitation. Leadership means serving the people you're responsible for, not the other way around. It means making difficult decisions based on the best available information, while accepting responsibility for the consequences. It means admitting when you're wrong and learning from those mistakes. General Williams studied her for a long moment. You sound very different from the sergeant who sat in this chair 6 months ago.
I am very different, General. That sergeant thought she knew everything.
This sergeant knows how much she still has to learn. What will you do differently as an NCO? Maria had been thinking about this question for weeks. I'll listen more and talk less. I'll ask questions instead of making assumptions. I'll focus on developing my soldiers instead of promoting myself, and I'll remember that respect is earned through service, not demanded through rank. Those are significant changes. They need to be, General. My previous approach to leadership was not only ineffective, it was potentially harmful to my soldiers and the mission. General Williams closed her folder and leaned back in her chair. Sergeant Rodriguez, I want you to know that what happened 6 months ago could have ended your military career. Your comments that morning were inappropriate and demonstrated a level of arrogance that was genuinely concerning. Maria nodded. I understand that, General. I understand that you gave me an opportunity to learn and grow instead of simply punishing me. Oh. I'm grateful for that chance. The opportunity was conditional, Williams replied. It required you to acknowledge your errors and demonstrate genuine change. Not everyone would have been capable of that level of self-reflection and growth. What happens now, General? Now you return to your unit and prove that your transformation is permanent. You'll be watched carefully by your chain of command to ensure that you apply what you've learned. General Williams opened her folder one final time and pulled out a single sheet of paper. You'll also receive a formal counseling statement documenting this entire experience. It will become part of your permanent record, both as a reminder of your errors and as documentation of your growth and potential. Maria accepted the paper and read through it quickly. The document was thorough but fair, describing both her inappropriate behavior and her subsequent learning and development. Thank you, General. I understand that consequences could have been much more severe. They still could be, Williams replied seriously. This experience will only be valuable if it produces lasting change in your leadership style and attitude. If you revert to your previous behaviors, the consequences will be swift and final. That won't happen, General. I hope not, Sergeant. Because the Army needs NCOs who understand what you've learned over the past 6 months. We need leaders who are humble enough to keep learning, confident enough to make difficult decisions, and dedicated enough to put service above self-promotion. Maria stood as General Williams prepared to leave. General, may I ask you a question? Of course. Why did you invest so much time and effort in teaching me these lessons? It would have been much simpler to just punish me and move on. End of the day. General Williams paused at the door. Because 35 years ago, a senior officer saw potential in a young, arrogant lieutenant who thought she knew everything about military leadership. Instead of ending my career, he gave me opportunities to learn and grow. She smiled slightly. Leadership development is one of the most important responsibilities of senior officers. Every soldier deserves the chance to become their best possible version, even when they start from a place of significant ignorance. Thank you for seeing that potential in me, General. Thank you for proving that it was there, Williams replied. Don't waste the opportunity, Sergeant. As General Williams left the conference room, Maria remained standing for several minutes, processing everything that had happened over the past 6 months. The journey from arrogant staff sergeant to humble leader had been painful, embarrassing, and transformative. She thought about the soldiers in her unit who would benefit from her new understanding of leadership. She thought about the mistakes she would avoid, the decisions she would make more carefully, and the example she would set for junior NCOs who might be struggling with their own ego and ambition. Most importantly, she thought about the lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her military career. True confidence comes from competence. True leadership comes from service, and true wisdom comes from the humility to acknowledge how much you still have to learn. 6 months ago, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had been convinced that she understood everything important about military leadership. Today, she understood that her real education was just beginning. But for the first time in her military career, she was excited about what she didn't know yet, rather than defensive about what she thought she already knew. And that, perhaps more than anything else, marked her transformation from a good soldier into a genuine leader. The woman who walked out of the conference room that day bore little resemblance to the one who had strutted into the mess hall 6 months earlier. Maria Rodriguez had learned the hardest lesson the military could teach: that true strength comes not from never falling down, but from how gracefully you get back up. And she had gotten back up with style, humility, and a newfound understanding of what it really meant to serve.